Well, good afternoon to those of you here in the chapel, others watching on Zoom. We're glad that you're all here. So I have to wonder, as we continue on in our study of Samuel and the law of Hutton, if you were tempted to yesterday perhaps go on to YouTube and see if you could find some old Hutton commercials. I did that, saw several of them, and if you didn't, they're all kind of the same. Oftentimes it's two men who are either at a ball game or in an airport or just someplace, and one of them talks about what their broker says, and the other says what their broker says, and the second one always says, well, my broker is E.F. Hutton, and E.F. Hutton says, and then everyone gathers around because the tagline, when E.F. Hutton talks, people listen. And so that's what we're talking about this week with the law of E.F. Hutton and using Samuel as our example. And so I'm excited about today's lesson. This whole week is going to be good. So buckle up, get ready. We're going for a ride. The law of E.F. Hutton just simply says, when the real leader speaks, people listen. And the idea is you could be in a room and there could be someone who is the appointed leader who has the title, but usually there's someone in the room that people want to hear from. And when that person speaks, all eyes, all ears are directed toward that individual. And usually it's their word that's heeded. And that's how you identify the real leader. That's what this law is all about. And so that's by way of review a little bit from yesterday. Let's look at our leadership thought for today. It says this: leaders should listen to God before, underline before, asking others to listen to them. Let me share that one more time. Leaders should listen to God before asking others to listen to them. So let's introduce our time today. Stephen R. Covey, of course, the creator of the 7 Habits, the books, and all the things that go with that. Stephen Covey said, because you listen, you become influenceable. And being influenceable, he goes on to say, is the key to influencing others. So in other words, if you want people to listen to you, then you have to listen first. Does that make sense? So as you listen, you become able to be influenced. And notice that the word there was listen, it wasn't hear. There's a big, big difference between hear and listen. I'm sure just about every wife out there knows exactly what I'm talking about. So just a statement here from John Maxwell's book, The 21 Most Powerful Minutes in a Leader's Day. John says, what started Samuel on the path of great leadership? Was there a moment when the seeds of leadership were sown in his life, giving him hope for positive influence in the lives of others? The turning point for Samuel occurred when he was still only a boy, when he opened his heart to God and decided to be influenced by him. And you remember the story well, that Samuel was woken up by a voice in the middle of the night several times. Each of the first 3 times or so, he thought it was Eli. And Eli kept telling him, go back to bed, go back to bed. You didn't really hear anything. Well, finally, the lights came on for Eli, and he realized, hey, maybe it's God. So Eli told Samuel, go back to bed. If you hear the voice one more time, just say, speak, Lord, for your servant hears. And of course, Samuel heard the voice one more time, and God said that to Samuel. And that began a whole life of listening to the voice of God. And so the point in Samuel's life is he first learned to listen to God, then he became a spokesperson for God. So, although he was young, Samuel modeled the very important lesson on getting into the position to hear from God. Three observations emerge from looking at the story of Samuel's life. Three observations emerge from his encounter with God that we just discussed that are instructional for you and for me. You see, Samuel assumed three things. One, the proper practice. First, the proper practice, then the proper posture, and then finally the proper place. Don't you like that alliteration? So let's unpack these three things. The proper practice. Samuel, even at a very young age, cultivated doing what was right before the Lord in his daily life. So he had a context of seeking out what was right, doing what was right. And it's interesting how it sure seems to me that the more a person makes a tangible effort to do right before the Lord, the more likely they are to want to listen to him to find out what it is, because we don't always know in advance, right? So we ask. So then in a general context of doing the right thing, then we go to seek the Lord more, and then, of course, we hear more. So that's the pattern. In 1 Samuel, chapter 2 and verse 18, it says, Samuel ministered before the Lord even as a child. And then in the same chapter, verse 26, it says, the child Samuel grew in stature and in favor both with the Lord and with men. Now, what's interesting about that verse is that the very same thing is later on said about Jesus, that he grew in stature with the Lord and with men. So there's a key point that I want to share with you on each of these three topics, the proper practice. So here, this key point for this proper practice is this: being righteous is more important for a leader than focusing on other responsibilities. Because really, we can only lead out of who we are. Even more than what we do, it's who we are. That's what makes people want to follow us. If you want to be a leader worth following, then it's important to be righteous. Now, being righteous doesn't mean being perfect, because then we'd all be doomed to failure. But being righteous is more important than all of our agenda items that we have to get accomplished today. Let's move on. From the proper practice, we now move to the proper posture. In order to hear and recognize God's voice, we have to quiet ourselves before him. Prayer is not only speaking to God, but listening to him also. It's a two-way, think of it like a two-way radio, both listening and speaking. So isn't it interesting that when Samuel first heard God's voice, what was he doing? Well, it was the middle of the night, so he was sleeping. That's a pretty quiet atmosphere. As time went on, he learned to identify the voice of God, and then he responded to it. So what's the key point here? Leaders need to get away from their busy schedules and set aside time to listen to God's direction. And that's the kind of appointment that you don't want to just say, well, if I got the time, I'll do it, because you'll never have the time. Some things are so important that you make the time, whether you quote unquote have it or not. And this is one of those things. So schedule time, schedule thinking time, schedule reflecting time, schedule prayer time, because they're all so important. It's what gives us balance. It's what allows us, puts us into position. That's what we mean by posture, to put us in the position to even hear God's voice, because if there's noise all around us, not just audio noise, but the noise of activity, we often don't hear God. It reminds me of one of the stories. I think it relates to Elijah. And Elijah was trying to hear the voice of God. And first there was a big wind, and the scripture tells us God wasn't in the wind. Then it says that there was a big earthquake, but God wasn't in the earthquake. And then all of a sudden Elijah hears this small, gentle voice. That's how God spoke. But see, earthquakes, those are loud. The wind, that's loud. But the still small voice was very quiet. And so if Elijah wasn't tuned in, he never would have heard God speak. So leaders, God wants to speak to you. He really does. He wants to give you guidance. He wants to give you direction when you have a dilemma. He wants to help you solve it. But we have to put ourselves in the position to even be ready to hear his voice. So, from proper practice and proper posture, we move on to one last proper, and that's a proper place. Now, according to 1 Samuel 3:3, this whole story about Samuel when he first heard the voice of God. In 1 Samuel 3:3, it tells us where Samuel was. Now we know he was in bed, but where was his bed? It was in the tabernacle. Well, Paul, what's so significant about that? Well, in that day, guess where the presence of God was manifested? In the tabernacle, and in particular in a place called the Holy of Holies, where the ark was. And Samuel was right next to that. So in a geographic sense, Samuel was close to where God's presence dwelt. And maybe that's coincidence, but something tells me it wasn't. That being close to God, drawing near to God, or the book of James tells us, draw near to God and he will draw near to us. And so leaders need to be close to God as well. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that we have to abandon our office or wherever it is we do our work and head to the nearest church and just hang out there. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is having a heart of worship so that everywhere you go, you are, in a sense, a sanctuary. You are the tabernacle of God because God lives within you, and where God lives, where he dwells, that's his tabernacle. And so it's really more about having a heart of worship, a heart of listening, a heart of seeking God wherever we are. Isn't it wonderful that you could have church 24/7, 365? You don't have to wait for that hour on Sunday. And so here's another key point then. Create a special place where you can go to connect with God. I remember one of the houses that I rented when we were in campus ministry. We were at Purdue University, and we lived in 6 different places in 7 years because that was just, well, what happened when you rent. And so one of the places that we lived in during that season, there was a special room in the basement that really didn't have any purpose. So I told my wife, I said, I want to make that the prayer room. And so I did that. And whenever I wanted to go and spend time, connect with God, that's where I would go. Now, it's not that I couldn't have gone anywhere else, but I just kind of set that place aside. Now, for some people, it might be there's a place out in their backyard. You got a porch swing or a rock or a tree, or maybe you go out to a state park or something. So all of that is good. The point is, find a place. Wherever it is, it might be inside, it might be outside. Where it is doesn't matter. What matters is that you have regular access to it so that you can go there. And that could be your own private sanctuary. So create the right circumstances, create the right place where you can go, be alone, And we like to use the word these days, especially on vacation, unplug from social media and all the rest, and find that place and find that time when you could connect with God, and make sure that you can access it regularly. And so as we bring this plane in for a landing today, let's conclude with this statement. If you want to become the kind of person that others listen to, then get better acquainted with God. Connect with him on a consistent basis, and you will increase the likelihood that you will connect with others. From page 71. Which brings us then to our question for reflection that we conclude all of our sessions with. So our question for today, for you to think about, is: do you spend enough time listening to God? So think about some of the things that we talked about. Do you have a time? Do you have a time carved out in your schedule? Do you have a place where you can go? Not that you can't. I mean, you can do it in your car when you're driving home, so you don't need to have a special place. But if you do, and it's kind of reserved for that, it's something that you can look forward to. So here's the question one more time. Do you spend enough time listening to God? So with that, we'll just let you ponder that for the rest of the day. And we certainly look forward to being back with you tomorrow at 3:30 for day number 3 of the Law of E.F. Hutton. So God bless you all. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow.